Judith Holloway rode steadily across the scorched plains, the dry wind whipping against her face, carrying the faint scent of dust and sun-baked earth. The land stretched endlessly, barren and unforgiving, the remnants of past droughts etched into the cracked soil. The skeletal outlines of withered plants and the occasional charred stump marked the desolation. Every step of her horse sent small clouds of dust swirling into the air, a reminder of how few had dared travel this way in years. Abandoned way stations and toppled signposts stood as silent witnesses to the travelers who had vanished or moved on long ago. Judith had left behind the small, empty homestead that had once been filled with the warmth of family, a house now only haunted by memories and the whisper of wind through its broken windows. The decision to move north had been heavy on her heart, but the promise of canyons and rivers, of land still viable and untamed, drew her forward with a quiet urgency. The sun was still low, casting long shadows across the plain, each one stretching like the fingers of some unseen hand reaching for her. Her horse's hooves left deep impressions in the dry earth, a temporary trace of life in a landscape determined to forget. On the third day, the monotony of the plains was broken by unexpected signs. The impressions of wagon wheels pressed deep into the dust. Straps from toppled crates tangled across the road. Something had happened here, something recent, and the air seemed charged with unease. Judith slowed her mount as she approached a lone ridge of jagged rocks rising from the plain, a formation that stood like a sentinel over the barren land. Her horse snorted, tense, ears swiveling to catch the slightest sound. Among the rocks, a figure slumped against the stone, barely able to remain upright. It was Keller Reed, once a guide of note, now wounded and weary from an attack whose perpetrators remained a mystery. His eyes met hers with a mixture of exhaustion and guarded hope. Judith dismounted swiftly, moving with care so as not to startle him further. She reached into the crevice where he had stumbled and helped lift him free, supporting his weight as he leaned heavily on her arm. Each movement was deliberate, cautious, a fragile dance between two people thrown together by chance and circumstance. She guided him away from the shadows of the rocks, her presence a quiet assurance against the stark isolation of the plains. The wind shifted, carrying the faint sounds of distant crows and the dry rustle of scrub. And for a moment, the world felt suspended, waiting to see what would come next. Keller adjusted his footing, testing the strength of his legs and the steadiness of the ground beneath him. He leaned on her shoulder, gratitude mingling with a weariness born of recent danger. Judith's eyes swept over the desolate horizon, noting the endless expanse, the harsh sun climbing slowly higher, and the distant lines of the northern canyons. They were far from any other traveler, their path fraught with uncertainty, yet the bond formed in that instant between them, fragile and unspoken, marked the beginning of something neither could yet name. Together, they moved cautiously along the ridge, each step measured, each glance scanning the land for threats hidden beneath the glaring light of the early morning. The broken crates and wagon tracks served as grim reminders of the dangers that lingered unseen. And Judith's senses sharpened with a mixture of fear and resolve. She had survived loss and the relentless cruelty of the plains. Now she was learning to navigate the precarious balance between caution and courage. Keller followed, leaning when necessary, adjusting to her pace, trusting her instinct and the steady guidance she provided. They advanced slowly, every rustle of the dry brush and every shifting shadow suggested the presence of unseen eyes. Judith felt the weight of the journey ahead, the magnitude of the land, and the fragility of life in a place so unforgiving. Yet there was also a current of determination, a quiet pulse of defiance against the stark emptiness surrounding them. The bond between them deepened with each careful step across the sun-baked soil, their mutual reliance weaving a subtle but undeniable connection. Time seemed suspended as they moved, the vast expanse of the plains a canvas of hardship, yet also of opportunity. They approached the edge of the ridge, where the plains fell away into deeper shadows and the promise of distant water and shelter beckoned. Judith glanced at Keller, noting the lines of strain on his face, the way he leaned on her, trusting her guidance. She realized that their paths had intertwined in ways neither could yet comprehend, that the solitude of the plains had brought them together at a moment when both needed presence, support, and shared resolve. The wind continued to whip across the open ground, carrying dust and the faint scent of distant rocks, a reminder that this was a land that demanded respect, attention, and careful navigation. Judith steadied herself, feeling the strength and weight of her horse beneath her, the faint tremor in Keller's step, and the uncertainty that lay ahead. Every movement, every glance, every careful step along the ridge reinforced the bond that had formed between them. They were two figures against the vast expanse of desolation, yet together they created a semblance of order and purpose in a place defined by chaos and abandonment. The sun climbed higher, casting a harsher light across the plains, illuminating the cracked earth, the scattered debris of previous travelers, and the distant jagged outlines of canyons that promised refuge and resources. Judith adjusted her reins, her eyes scanning the horizon, the soft dust rising from the dry soil, marking their path, a trace of their presence in an otherwise indifferent land. Keller shifted slightly, steadying himself, and together they continued, moving cautiously, but with a growing sense of determination. The air was heavy with anticipation, the quiet hum of the plains a constant reminder that danger could arrive unseen. Yet in this shared movement, in this quiet cooperation, they found a measure of reassurance. Every ridge, every shadow, every careful observation sharpened their awareness and strengthened the fragile trust between them.
Keller Reed, having regained some strength after his injury, began to assess the terrain with careful attention, moving with a cautious steadiness that belied the lingering pain in his leg. The canyon walls rose sharply around them, sun-bleached stones stretching high into the sky, their surfaces cracked and weathered from decades of wind and heat. The narrow path ahead wound like a ribbon of pale sand between jagged rock formations, the only route through this isolated stretch of wilderness. Keller's experience guided every step, his eyes scanning for signs of danger, for the faint traces left by those who had passed before them. He understood the significance of the tracks and scattered debris, the remnants of a world that moved quietly beneath the harsh glare of the Utah sun. The documents he had been carrying with the caravan had been important, detailing the ownership and potential development of lands along the San Rafael River, and he knew that someone had sought them deliberately, that the attack was no accident. The intent had been clear: to drive settlers away and seize control of water and fertile ground for personal gain. Judith followed close, attentive to his movements, her own eyes sweeping the canyon floor for hints of what had transpired. The wind stirred the dry sand, lifting it in thin, shifting clouds that threatened to erase every trace, and she noticed the subtle markers that could easily be missed: a splintered arrow lodged in a rock, the pattern of hoofprints pressed deep into the earth, small stones arranged in an almost deliberate sequence as if signaling a path or warning. Each observation strengthened her sense of purpose, a burgeoning resolve that transcended mere survival. They pressed onward, moving along the winding dry washes, the rhythm of their footsteps mingling with the soft whistle of the wind through the rocks. The canyon narrowed, shadows deepening in the crevices, and the remains of the caravan appeared suddenly before them. A wagon lay toppled on its side, its frame splintered, wheels bent awkwardly into the sand. Around it, the ground bore silent testimony to a brief but fierce struggle, the earth marked by hurried movement, scuffed footprints, and the signs of a fight that had been over in moments, yet left enduring traces. Judith surveyed the scene, taking in the devastation with a mix of caution and growing determination. She understood now that her journey north was no longer solely about finding safe passage or escaping her past. The desolate canyon, the broken wagon, and the subtle signs of human intent ignited a sense of justice within her, a rare and potent force in a land where survival often outweighed morality. Keller moved carefully among the debris, pointing out fragments and remnants that might offer clues, each observation reinforcing the sense of a deliberate attack. Judith's awareness sharpened as she followed, every detail etched into her mind. The deep grooves of wagon wheels, the angular impressions of hooves, the fragments of supplies strewn across the sand. She felt the weight of responsibility pressing lightly but firmly upon her, an understanding that their actions here could influence the fate of those who would follow this path, and perhaps even challenge the ambitions of those who sought to claim the land by force. The canyon pressed in around them, a silent witness to the unfolding story, and they moved with quiet determination, each step a mixture of caution and resolve. Judith's resolve grew with each measured advance, the desolation of the canyon becoming both a trial and a proving ground for her strength, her perception, and her capacity to act in the face of deliberate threat. The wind swept through the narrow passage, carrying dust and whispers of past struggles, and she felt herself attuned to the rhythm of the land, aware of its subtle cues and the hidden dangers that could strike without warning. Together they navigated the dry washes and jagged rocks, the evidence of the ambush guiding their path, shaping their understanding of the world they traversed. Judith's steps became more deliberate, her senses heightened, and a quiet determination settled over her. This was no longer a journey for mere survival, but a passage that demanded courage, insight, and a nascent sense of justice that would continue to grow with each mile through the sun-baked canyon. Judith and Keller made camp in the shadowed canyon, choosing a narrow stretch of sandy ground where the walls curved around them like protective arms. The fire they built flickered softly against the rock face, sending shadows dancing across the jagged surfaces and reflecting off the dry, weathered stone. The night air settled thick and heavy, carrying a chill that crept along the canyon floor, rustling dry grasses and stirring loose stones. The canyon's natural acoustics amplified every whisper of wind, every distant rustle, and Judith felt her pulse quicken with each sound. The peace they had hoped for in the day had vanished with the setting sun. As darkness deepened, the quiet was no longer comforting. It became tense, deliberate, like a living presence pressing against the edges of their camp. The usual nocturnal noises of the desert, the distant cry of a coyote, the scurry of small creatures over rocks, were punctuated by subtle disturbances that spoke of human movement. Leaves shifted in precise patterns, sand slid unnaturally along the slopes, and the firelight occasionally wavered as though disturbed by a hidden hand. Judith's eyes followed every flicker, every subtle motion, the muscles in her back and arms taut with anticipation. Each sound that might have been an illusion carried the weight of threat, and she felt the canyon closing around her. Keller moved silently through the perimeter of the camp, his eyes sharp in the dim glow, his hands brushing over rocks and scrub to catch the slightest disturbance in the earth. He returned with the grim knowledge of who hunted them. Levi Harrow, a man with the training and cunning of a former military scout, now turned into a shadowy predator of the wilderness. He had gathered men who lived outside law and order, men who claimed the land by force and demanded submission from anyone who crossed their path. Harrow saw the travelers and settlers not as neighbors, but as obstacles, threats to be removed, their possessions seized. His presence was a careful, controlled menace, the type that lingered at the edges of perception, letting fear take root before striking. Judith absorbed the weight of this revelation with a cold clarity. She had left her past behind, fleeing loss and desolation, and now the world presented her with another kind of trial. She realized that their situation demanded more than survival. It required vigilance, insight, and the willingness to stand against someone who would take everything from those who were unprepared. The documents Keller carried were the spark, and Levi Harrow was the fire. But the canyon itself, the landscape that had seemed indifferent, became a partner and a barrier, offering concealment and strategic vantage points if they could read it correctly. Night stretched on, each hour a slow, deliberate test of endurance. Sounds of movement came in deliberate bursts, too methodical to be random, too precise to be anything but human. The flicker of distant torches caught the edges of the canyon walls, and Judith could sense the approach of calculated observation, the methodical patience of a predator who knew the value of waiting. Harrow did not attack immediately. He observed, gauged, calculated. The tension was a living entity in the camp, pressing against them from every angle, sharpening senses and instincts alike. Judith moved quietly, checking the fire, adjusting small rocks around the perimeter to prevent any noise from betraying their presence. Every creak of wood, every crunch of sand beneath a foot became a signal to be interpreted. She found herself attentive to the smallest details, the direction of a falling stone, the way shadows shifted across the canyon floor, the subtle traces left by those who had passed unseen. Each observation became a tool, each breath a measure of awareness. She felt a strange clarity emerging through the fear, a disciplined focus that fused her instincts with her growing confidence in Keller's judgment and guidance. Keller remained alert at her side, pointing out subtle changes in the terrain, the traces of movement in the sand, the slight alterations in the rocks where someone might have tested their footing. He instructed her with quiet gestures, teaching her to read the signs that the wilderness offered, to anticipate the threats before they became direct. Judith realized that this night demanded not just courage, but presence, a steady mind, and the ability to act without hesitation. As the hours crept forward, the canyon seemed to breathe with them. Each gust of wind, each shifting shadow, a part of the tension that stretched across the landscape. Judith felt the weight of the documents, the importance of their safe delivery, mingling with the responsibility to defend the life they had forged in these cliffs. The firelight became a measure of time, its flicker marking the slow crawl of night, the patient waiting of Levi Harrow, and the quiet preparation for whatever moment of confrontation might come. The darkness was a proving ground, testing not just endurance, but the transformation of the woman who had once feared for every step, who had once seen the world as a place of random peril. Now, every choice, every movement carried purpose. The awareness of Harrow's observation sharpened her, made her body and mind align in readiness. And with each shift in the shadows, Judith understood that her journey had evolved from flight to vigilance. She was no longer only seeking safe passage. She was learning to claim a measure of control, to impose her own presence in a world that sought to erase the unprepared. The night passed in slow waves of tension, the canyon a silent witness to their endurance. Judith felt the quiet transformation within her, the nascent strength that came from knowing that protection was no longer optional but necessary. Not just for herself, but for Keller, for the land they traversed, for the principles that survival alone could not sustain. By the time the first faint light of dawn brushed the upper reaches of the canyon walls, Judith's fear had transformed into resolve, a calm certainty born of careful observation, measured action, and the understanding that some threats required more than avoidance. They demanded presence, courage, and a willingness to stand firm in a world that would test every measure of strength, intelligence, and determination she possessed. The canyon remained still as the night surrendered to the light, and Judith, with Keller at her side, felt the first real pulse of readiness for what lay ahead. The shadows had taught her vigilance, the silence had taught her patience, and the constant, deliberate presence of threat had revealed a new power within her, the capacity to protect, to act decisively, and face a world that would test every measure of strength, intelligence, and determination she possessed.
They left the canyon at dawn, the pale light spilling over the jagged cliffs and painting the rocks with faint gold. The trail that wound along the river was narrow and precarious, a ribbon of earth clinging to the edge of the cliffs, hidden from view below. The water below moved silently through the depths, its surface catching fragments of the early light, a mirror of the vast sky above. The wind swept through the canyon with sharp intensity, biting at exposed skin and whipping hair into their faces. Yet it carried a cover for their passage, erasing their footprints as they climbed. Every careful step sent small pebbles rattling down the cliff, their sound absorbed by the vast emptiness, and they moved with a deliberate caution that matched the rhythm of the river beneath them. Keller led the way, his body moving with the certainty of one who had traveled these trails countless times in his youth, guiding caravans through this labyrinth of stone and water. His memory traced the hidden curves of the cliffs, the safe footholds, the places where the trail narrowed to a dangerous thinness and the river below roared in a distant echo. He had known a world that required constant calculation, a world where one wrong step could end the lives of those in his charge. Now, alongside him, Judith learned to move with the same awareness, letting her senses stretch beyond the simple act of walking. She began to notice details that might have gone unseen, a branch cut at an odd angle, an indentation in a rock that might have been a handhold, the glint of metal in the dry grass suggesting someone had passed through recently. Each observation fed the growing sense of their shared vigilance. Judith's endurance became evident as they ascended higher, her muscles adjusting to the uneven ground, her legs finding footing where others might falter. The air thinned as they climbed, carrying the scent of dust and stone. The sharp aroma of the river mingled with the faint trace of pine and sage from the canyon floor. The trail forced them to move in quiet harmony, each step measured, each pause deliberate. Keller began to rely on her insights as much as his own instincts, the subtle hints she provided shaping the path they took. The trust between them grew slowly, solidifying like the first shoots of green through parched earth, a quiet bond that did not need words. They followed the contour of the cliffs for hours, moving through narrow passages where the sun barely reached, the walls towering on either side, shadows deepening in the folds of stone. The river below turned sharp angles around rocky outcrops, the sound of its flow a distant but constant guide. Judith's eyes caught small irregularities in the trail, small disturbances that hinted at other travelers, some recent, some older. She marked these silently, the information passing between her and Keller through gestures and shared glances, a language of movement honed in the crucible of survival. By mid-morning, they came across an old cabin, abandoned long ago by miners or prospectors. The structure leaned slightly, its timbers bleached by sun and wind, its roof patched with remnants of old boards. Inside, the walls bore fresh marks, footprints in the dust, and faint impressions where objects had been recently moved. The cabin provided a temporary refuge, a place to catch their breath and observe. Every corner was examined carefully, every shadow considered a potential hiding place for danger. They understood immediately that someone had passed through recently, the presence of Levi Harrow's followers a tangible pressure against their progress. The realization sharpened their urgency, the hours ahead becoming a race against unseen pursuers moving through the same rugged landscape. They rested briefly, replenishing water from small pools near the cabin, checking supplies, and adjusting their gear. Judith's movements were deliberate, her eyes constantly scanning, noting every subtle sign of the environment and the enemy. Keller watched her with quiet approval, recognizing how she had transformed from a woman fleeing loss to a partner capable of interpreting the terrain and anticipating threats.
Their timing, their coordination, and their shared instinct became their shield, allowing them to navigate the cliffs and river path with cautious efficiency. As they continued along the trail, the canyon walls narrowed and widened intermittently, forcing them to adapt constantly. Judith's awareness of the environment became almost instinctive, noting where loose rock could signal a recent passage, where brush concealed uneven ground, and how the wind might carry sound to anyone observing from above or below. Each movement became a small exercise in strategy, a silent negotiation with the land itself. Keller guided her through the most precarious stretches, but increasingly, he allowed her judgments to shape their route, trusting her emerging skill and intuition. The river wound below them in long, hidden bends, a quiet mirror of the sky, its slow current contrasting with the precarious trail above. They paused at several points where the path narrowed to a ledge, the drop into the water below a reminder of the stakes they faced. Here, their progress slowed, measured in careful steps and silent communication. Judith noticed subtle traces in the sand along the ledge, footprints not their own, a scattering of stones moved as if by a passing rider. Each observation heightened their awareness, reinforcing the need for caution and precision. The climb and the long morning brought them to a higher vantage point where the canyon stretched out below, sun glinting off the river's twists and turns. From this height, they could see distant shapes of cliffs and ridges, potential hiding places and approaches that might be used against them. They moved deliberately along the trail, ever alert to the possibility of pursuit, their minds trained to interpret the signs left by others. The landscape itself became a participant in their journey, shaping their decisions and forcing them to act with thought and coordination. As the day advanced, their pace remained steady, balancing the need for progress with the need for caution. Every break, every brief rest along the trail was accompanied by vigilance, scanning for movement in the cliffs, for the reflection of sun off metal, for traces left by those who might follow. Judith and Keller moved as a team, their trust in each other solidifying, their awareness of the terrain and its dangers deepening. Each step on the narrow trail was a negotiation with the environment, a test of endurance and focus, building a rhythm that carried them forward inch by inch through the winding path along the river. By late afternoon, the trail led them past rocky alcoves and outcroppings, some offering shelter, some exposing them to the elements. Judith's endurance was evident as she adapted to the constantly changing path, her senses sharpened, her focus unwavering. Keller continued to guide, occasionally pointing out subtle signs, a broken branch, a disturbed patch of soil, the glint of distant metal, and Judith absorbed every detail, translating them into action and caution. Together, they moved forward, the river below a constant, winding companion, the cliffs their protector and their obstacle, each step bringing them closer to safety and yet deeper into the challenges that awaited beyond the next bend. As the sun began to descend, casting long shadows across the cliffs and illuminating the river in bands of light and shadow, the trail, narrow and unforgiving, demanded constant attention, and both travelers felt the strain in their bodies, tempered by the growing confidence in their combined skill. They moved with purpose, each step a blend of endurance, awareness, and careful judgment. Judith's observations became instinctive, Keller's guidance precise, and together they navigated the cliffside trail with the cautious determination that had become their rhythm, every moment a measure of vigilance and shared strength.
They reached the wide bend of the river just as the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting the canyon walls in long shadows and painting the water with streaks of gold and deep amber. The valley ahead seemed calm at first glance, the river winding gently through open space, the terrain falling into a deceptive tranquility. Yet Keller noticed immediately that the earth bore signs of recent movement, disturbed patches where horses had turned, flattened grass, and the faint smell of smoke lingering from a hastily abandoned fire. The scene spoke clearly of preparation and intention. Levi Harrow had anticipated their arrival, setting the valley as a stage for a confrontation, and the quiet beauty of the landscape became a trap masked by nature itself. Judith and Keller paused on a rocky rise overlooking the bend, assessing the terrain with careful attention. Every curve of the river, every clump of sagebrush, every shadow cast by a boulder was scrutinized for advantage or threat. They moved deliberately, using the natural cover of the landscape to their benefit, finding high rocks to observe from, low ridges to shield their movement, and dense patches of vegetation that could hide their approach or provide a sudden exit. The valley, though open in appearance, offered a network of natural fortifications to those who knew how to read it, and Keller guided them with a measured eye, pointing out subtle variations in slope and sightlines that could be exploited. Judith's presence became pivotal in their strategy, her instincts guiding the placement of both of them within the landscape. She moved with an intuitive understanding of how to use the terrain, positioning herself where she could observe and control potential avenues of approach while maintaining a line of escape. She spotted slight depressions in the ground that could serve as makeshift cover, pathways that curved behind the largest boulders, and the soft undulations of the earth that would conceal their movements from observers at a distance. Keller observed her closely, recognizing how quickly her confidence and awareness had grown, how her mind read the environment with precision, turning every detail into an advantage. As evening settled, the first horsemen appeared on the ridge above the valley, their shadows long and their movements deliberate. They were scouts, cautious and alert, advancing with the intention of assessing the situation before committing fully. The riders slowed as they noticed the absence of movement, the seeming emptiness of the valley, and their strategy became one of intimidation rather than immediate attack. Judith remained calm, her senses alert to every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, every faint shift in the air that might signal a hidden presence. Keller's eyes followed her movements, noting how she adjusted positions, made slight gestures of signaling, and coordinated their actions without speaking, a silent communication of awareness and intent. The air grew tense as shadows lengthened and the temperature dropped, the canyon carrying sounds with eerie clarity. Every distant noise seemed magnified, the soft clatter of horse hooves on rock, the faint creak of saddles, the wind shifting through the sagebrush. Judith's posture became deliberate in ways Keller recognized as both defensive and commanding. She had transformed from a woman fleeing loss into a presence that shaped the battle before it had even begun. Every choice she made within the landscape carried weight, dictating how they would move, where they would wait, and how they would respond. Keller sensed the change fully, the emergence of a resilience that would no longer allow him to consider her as someone needing protection alone. Night deepened over the valley, and the first scouts began to probe the area more actively, testing the edges of their concealment, circling closer to the positions Keller and Judith had chosen. The pair shifted subtly between cover, always keeping to the shadowed terrain, making use of the boulders, shrubs, and natural depressions in the earth. Judith's sharp eyes detected the minutest disturbances, the bent stems of sage, the glint of reflected moonlight off metal, the faint outlines of figures moving with caution. She guided Keller's attention and coordinated their responses, silently directing them toward spots where they could observe without being seen, where they could manipulate the enemy's perception of the terrain. The tension stretched as hours passed, a taut thread that neither could afford to loosen. Every movement from the scouts, every distant sound, every shift in the wind was interpreted and acted upon with careful deliberation. Judith anticipated pathways the enemy might take, adjusting their positioning to ensure control over any engagement. She noted where the terrain funneled movement, where natural barriers could delay or confuse the scouts, and where sudden openings could be used for a countermove. Her intuition became a critical weapon, an unseen force shaping the confrontation before it erupted. As darkness fully enveloped the valley, the scouts withdrew temporarily, regrouping along the ridge as they prepared to return with reinforcements. Judith remained alert, her eyes scanning every movement in the low light, her posture relaxed but ready, projecting an energy of calm command. Keller observed the subtle shifts in her behavior, recognizing how completely she had assumed a role of leadership within their fragile, precarious advantage. She had become the center of their strategy, her presence the linchpin holding together the small tactical advantage they had carved from the landscape. They remained in position through the night, using intermittent glances and subtle gestures to communicate. Every sound, every movement was filtered through Judith's perception, translated into action and preemptive adjustments in their positioning. Keller followed her guidance, trusting her instincts as much as his own experience. The valley, once seeming tranquil, had become a living chessboard, each stone, bush, and shadow a piece in the unfolding contest of awareness, patience, and readiness. By the early hours before dawn, the scouts had returned to the ridge above the valley, signaling the approach of larger forces. Judith and Keller adjusted positions again, the terrain bending to their use. Every aspect of their environment had been surveyed, every possible path of approach noted, and every cover maximized. Judith's focus never wavered, and Keller recognized the unspoken bond that had grown between them through hours of vigilance. Their combined awareness created a sense of inevitability. The valley would no longer be a trap in the hands of their pursuers, but a stage they controlled, shaped by patience, endurance, and a growing strength that neither had possessed alone.
When the first distant figures of Harrow's main force appeared along the ridge at dawn, Judith's readiness guided their actions. Every movement had been anticipated, every position chosen to exploit the natural advantages of the terrain, and every possible escape route accounted for. The wide bend of the river, once a deceptive calm, had become a controlled environment for survival, a space in which their awareness and coordination could hold the balance between danger and command. Judith's strength and insight had transformed the valley. Keller's experience reinforced every decision, and together they prepared to meet the coming confrontation with a determination rooted in shared vigilance and trust.
The first rays of dawn stretched across the canyon, spilling pale gold light over the jagged cliffs and winding river below. The air was still, holding the weight of anticipation as Judith and Keller stood side by side, scanning the horizon for the movement of Levi Harrow's forces. The valley was quiet now, but the knowledge of what was coming charged every shadow and every fold of the land. The distant sound of horses' hooves grew steadily, their rhythm deliberate, echoing faintly against the stone walls of the canyon. Dust rose in thin clouds from the dry riverbed, carried on the cold morning wind, and the faint metallic glint of weapons caught in the first light signaled the approach of those who had once brought terror across these lands. Judith's eyes narrowed as she traced the contours of the terrain, noting the natural channels, the hidden depressions, the overhanging rocks that could serve as shelter or traps. Every detail mattered. Keller's experience complemented her instinct. He had walked these lands many times, guided caravans through hidden passes, and read the subtle signals left by those who moved with intention. Together they were a single force, one mind divided across two bodies, each movement anticipating the other. They had no fear now, only focus, a precision born of necessity and experience. As Harrow's men entered the narrow bends of the river valley, Judith moved silently ahead, directing them into the paths she had memorized. Loose rocks shifted under the hooves of approaching horses, their clatter masked by the wind, and steep ledges forced the enemy into constricted spaces where movement was limited.
Hidden crevices and overhanging boulders became instruments of defense. Keller flanked the approaches with calculated steps, reinforcing Judith's guidance, using the knowledge of terrain to create advantage. The clash began with sudden intensity, a controlled storm of dust, hoofbeats, and shouted commands muffled by the canyon walls. Every motion Judith made, every decision Keller enacted, served to guide the enemy into traps invisible until the moment they became unavoidable. The battle was decisive in its brevity, a concentrated force shaped by strategy rather than chaos. Each ridge, each stone, each narrow path became a tool in their hands, a weapon wielded with precision born from understanding rather than impulse. The enemy faltered quickly under the constant pressure. Horses stumbled over rocks, riders lost formation, and confusion spread among Harrow's men. Those who had expected an easy path to conquest found themselves forced into positions they could not control, surrounded by resistance that seemed to anticipate every movement. Judith moved with careful calculation, noting the smallest signs, the direction of dust clouds, the echo of distant shouts, the pattern of footprints in the dirt. Keller mirrored her awareness, intercepting any attempt to break through and guiding the enemy where they could be most effectively contained. The valley itself seemed to aid them. The cliffs and river bends channeled the attack, turning the natural landscape into a fortress, into an ally. Time and again the enemy was forced back, their advantage stripped away by the relentless combination of knowledge, instinct, and precision. Harrow's confidence dissolved as he realized the miscalculation, the loss of control over the ground that had been intended as a simple conquest. Retreat became the only option. As the last of Harrow's forces withdrew, the valley slowly exhaled. Dust hung in the morning air, drifting across the scars left by the conflict. Broken branches, disturbed soil, and fragments of equipment marked the space where struggle had unfolded. But the river flowed steadily, undisturbed, reflecting the soft gold of the rising sun. The wind moved through the canyon, lifting fine grains of sand into small dancing eddies, a reminder of the land's resilience. Judith and Keller remained on the ridge, surveying the aftermath, bodies tense yet easing as the immediate threat passed. Their senses, honed through vigilance, slowly allowed the recognition of survival, of a battle fought and won. But the awareness of the world's dangers remained, tempered by the knowledge of their shared capabilities. They descended carefully toward the river, moving through boulders and sagebrush, the weight of the night's fear replaced by a quiet confidence. Each step was deliberate, an acknowledgement of the care required to traverse land that could shift from ally to threat in an instant. Judith's eyes scanned constantly, noting the minutiae of the terrain, the traces of enemy movement, the subtle signs left behind in haste. Keller's movements matched hers, silent and assured, reflecting the understanding that had developed between them through trial and necessity. The river wound below, a silver ribbon of calm in contrast to the chaos that had raged, a reminder of continuity amidst the upheaval of human endeavor. They paused atop a rocky outcrop, overlooking a wide curve of the river, watching the shifting light illuminate cliffs and water alike. There was a moment of stillness, a recognition of the battle concluded. The danger passed, yet the future remained uncertain. Judith's gaze lingered northward, tracing the path that stretched beyond the valley, the promise of new lands and challenges calling silently. Keller observed her with measured thought, appreciating the quiet strength she had cultivated, the precision in her movements, the instinctive awareness that had guided them through the confrontation. Together they understood the power of partnership, the ability to face the unknown not as individuals, but as a single, coordinated force. The canyon held its breath around them, the river below reflecting the clarity of morning and the endurance of those who had emerged victorious. As the sun rose higher, bathing the valley in warm light, the dust settled and the air cleared. the river continuing its steady course. Judith and Keller remained side by side, understanding that their journey, once marked by solitude and loss, had merged into a shared path. The land had tested them, revealed strengths and limitations, and now offered a quiet, measured promise of possibilities ahead. Each step forward would require vigilance, endurance, and cooperation, and each step would be taken with the knowledge that neither stood alone. The river flowed steadily below, carrying away the remnants of struggle and offering the quiet assurance of continuity. They moved forward with the sun at their backs, the landscape open and alive, and the understanding of shared resilience between them, unspoken, yet absolute. If you enjoyed this story and want to follow more epic adventures, make sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and join us as the journey continues.